Hello, hello. We are on part 3 of Unit 10 on liquids and solids. And the first two parts covered the different types of intermolecular forces, how to know which ones you have, their relative strength. And if you don't have a good understanding of that, you should go back and watch those because now we want to make some comparisons. So when we look at different liquids, we're going to see that their abilities, their properties vary depending on those intermolecular forces. So the first one we have today is surface tension. Now, surface tension is roughly a measurement of quantitatively, how much energy it would take to stretch or increase the surface area of a liquid. And so you could just think of sticking your hand into water. And to do that, to insert yourself into water, you're causing intermolecular forces to break apart. And it overall increases how much surface area there is. So within the material, you can see there all these arrows are showing uh, attraction of usually polar molecules. What we find at the surface is it tends to strengthen since it can't form intermolecular forces with the air typically above it. It strengthens the intermolecular forces at that surface, so it's almost kind of like a thick skin. You've felt surface tension if you've ever belly flopped. You probably know that if you want to jump into a pool of water, it feels better to jump in head first or feet first as opposed to just not nice and wide with a belly flop. Because when you belly flop with all that surface, you're trying to increase the surface area of the water, and there's a whole lot of energy going into your belly, and it doesn't feel very good. There's a lot of different ways we see surface tension. One of those is if you've ever been pouring a drink and you pour it out of something slowly and it starts to run down the bottom of it, it's like kind of sticking towards it. That's surface tension. Again, we're going to see that things with stronger IMFs, intermolecular forces, have greater surface tension. Many insects, they can literally land on water because, again, you can think of the surface as this extra thick layer where there's a lot of hydrogen bonding. If we were in class, I'd show you, and this is something you can do at home. You can make a paper clip or other thin pieces of metal float on water. Now, if you just drop a paper clip onto water, it's going to go straight through. But if you can put it on there gentle enough, you can get paper clips to float. So even though iron is about 8 times denser than water, the surface tension can hold it up. Here, this is an image of a big cat coming up out of the water, and you see this bubble effect going on, and so it hasn't broken the surface tension yet. This is this kid I know named Sam, and it's almost a shame that this whole coronavirus thing's going on because this is one of my favorite labs. Is we'll take a big bowl, put of soapy water, we put dry ice inside of it, and it bubbles up this CO2 gas. And then I lied. It's not soapy water. We then will screen the surface with soapy water and get this very large bubble. And so typically at the end of this chapter, we do a dry ice lab where we blow up bottles and we play with dry ice, and it's fun. But well, we don't get to do that this year, so that's kind of sad. Now, if you do have a parent, a guardian, you can go and buy it at Harps near Shiloh. You can go and ask them, and you can get some dry ice. You have to be 18 or older to buy it, but it's just kind of neat. Now, due to these intermolecular forces, different types, you get cohesion and adhesion. This just refers to whether it's more likely to adhere to itself, cohesion, or whether it's more likely to adhere to something other than itself. So mercury is very cohesive. Mercury, if you, it's the symbol, or its symbol Hg, hydrogyros. It means quicksilver, and the reason it acts quick, it flows and runs across a lot of surfaces, is it doesn't really attract anything, and so it adheres, or sorry, it's cohesive. It sticks to itself. If you put it in a test tube, like you're seeing here, this thin glass tube, it doesn't attract to the surface like you normally see water. And so instead of a meniscus, you're getting a convex curve instead of a concave curve. Again, water is very adhesive. Water likes to stick to things. Again, if you ever get wet, if water splashes on you, like you might shake off, but there's still going to be some water droplets until it evaporates away. It's just really good at sticking to other things. Now, if you have a greater amount of adhesion where it sticks to other stuff than cohesion, this can result in capillary action. Again, that's the general cause for the meniscus, where water is adhering to the glass, and so it climbs up the surface. But in biology, if you've ever done this experiment with flowers or here's celery, this is the fundamental way how plants get water up into their entire system. So their roots are pulling in water, and through capillary action, it's in a sense pumping it up, but it's water just kind of grabbing hold to places where there's less and less water, but it draws it up because there's more adhesion where waters form hydrogen bonding, and it's climbing. It's going against gravity. Another physical property of water or of liquids is viscosity. Now, viscosity is the resistance to flow. So if you were to say liquids were fluid, then viscosity, well, how non-fluid is it? So when we think of water, we normally think they have very low viscosity. So you pour out a glass of water and it just flows. But if you think of honey or syrups, things that when you try to pour out, they just kind of take a while, we say they're very viscous. In the next chapter, we'll talk about gases, and we'll say gases are perfect fluids. So gases can pretty much move about with almost no resistance to flow. So they have virtually zero viscosity. But again, if we want to know, hey, why is honey so viscous? Why are, again, things like syrups, why does it take so long for them to flow? They have stronger intermolecular forces. So the stronger the intermolecular forces, the less they're going to flow, and we say they're more viscous. Here's a fun little table that has a whole bunch of numbers. So these values, basically, the larger the number, the more viscous it is. And so if you look at some of the ones up top, the smallest numbers, acetone and benzene, those chemicals are nonpolar. So, well, actually, acetone's polar, but benzene is nonpolar. It has only London dispersion forces holding it together. Acetone has weak dipole-dipole forces, but since those are the lower attractive intermolecular forces, they're more fluid. They have lower viscosity. If you then start to look at some of these other ones, as the values get bigger, we see things like water. Water is about 10 times less viscous or 10 times more fluid, and it's because it can hydrogen bond. Now, there's one of them that sticks out, glycerol. This is the stuff primarily found in Germ-X that makes it goopy and sloshy. So glycerin or glycerol has 3 carbons and then 3 oxygen hydrogens. So it can make lots and lots of hydrogen bonds. And so the more and stronger the intermolecular forces, the more viscous it's going to be. And then we would watch this video on non-Newtonian fluids, which is kind of an interesting subject. Again, you can make this by making what's normally called oobleck, which is just starch and water. So when you make a suspension, what's neat is it feels fluid. If you just move your hand through it slowly, then it moves right past it like a fluid. But if you start punching it or hit it or move your hand quickly, the more force applied to a non-Newtonian fluid makes them less viscous, and so they stiffen up. You can find, again, just YouTube non-Newtonian fluids, and you can find people who've made like pools out of this stuff, and it's just kind of weird because there's some where they'll have a hot tub filled with it or like a pool, and if you could literally run across it and not sink, but if you walk, you'll just sink to the bottom. This video, I think, talks more about ketchup. Okay, so here I mentioned syrup. So again, this is the drop test. So water to milk to oils to syrups. Why are these more viscous? Well, we look at composition. So really what's going on from water to milk to these syrups is you get more and more sugar. So this is the structure of sucrose. And again, what I want to point out is a lot of oxygen hydrogens, and each one of them are able to make hydrogen bonding. So the more sugar you have in a solvent, or the more of a polar solute that can hydrogen bond you put in your solvent, the more viscous it's going to be. Now, viscosity is also dependent on temperature. Just like boiling point, as you increase the temperature and things evaporate faster, in the same way, as temperature goes up, there's more thermal energy to break intermolecular forces, viscosity goes down. So you might know this if you want, liquidy hot fudge, but your hot fudge is in the refrigerator and it's solid, you put it in the microwave. And as it heats up, it becomes more and more fluid. So there's more energy to break intermolecular forces. This talk about motor oil. If you haven't gotten your oil changed, probably not. One thing you'll find is they'll ask you, what type of oil do you want? 5W20, 10W30. And what those numbers are ranking is relative viscosity. So if you live in a hot climate where it stays, above 80, 90, 100 degrees, you want an oil that starts off more viscous because it's only going to get less viscous and more fluid. But if you live in a cold climate where it stays, we're talking Minnesota, it might be -20. As it cools down, it's going to, what we'd say, thicken up, and viscosity will go up. And so you're going to start with these lower numbers. So higher the temperature, lower the viscosity. Now, probably a really important one is solventability, and this is just how well do they mix. So again, we had this in the last chapter. I mentioned like dissolves like. So polar molecules are soluble in polar solvents. So here's water, here's ethanol. So because they can both form hydrogen bonds, if they can have similar intermolecular forces, they're likely to dissolve. So sugar is highly soluble in water because it can form hydrogen bonds, and other polar things can form dipole-dipole. But then also ionic compounds, because then they can form ion-dipole force. So table salt in water or ammonia. So we've said before, water is known as the universal solvent, and it's because it can dissolve both polar things and ionic compounds. Now, if you have a non-polar solvent, some examples of that are benzene or hexane. There's a number of them. This is where you're going to find things that dissolve fats and oils and other non-polar stuff. So if it's non-polar, they have London dispersion forces. And again, it's like dissolves like. Again, so if just as an example, if we look at Gatorade, it's a clear solution where the solvent's water, and you can find things like citric acid and sucrose, sugar, and then here's potassium phosphate. So both of these can make lots of hydrogen bonds because they're polar molecules. And here's your electrolytes, your potassium phosphate. It is an ionic compound. So these are soluble in water. They would not be soluble in something like benzene. Now, if we're mixing multiple liquids, instead of using the word solvent, we usually talk about miscibility, whether they're miscible or not, but it really means the same thing. So if you mix acetone and water, they're both liquids. So it's not like solid sucrose or solid potassium phosphate dissolving. Instead, they're already both liquid and they're just mixing. And so here is acetone and water making hydrogen bonds. And so because of that, they're able to mix very, very well. They're very miscible. But you probably already know this. If you mix oil and water, here's what oleic acid, a very common oil, here's what it looks like. Notice all the carbon, 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 hydrogen, hydrogen. All of those bonds are nonpolar. So very, very nonpolar. So if you mix oil and water, they don't. We would say they are immiscible. And then here's a fun video you should watch about using Ultra Everdry, just a product you can buy and you can spray it on stuff. and it will make things super water repellent. Now, lastly, what if you want your oil and water to mix? So we know water is a universal solvent, but it's not truly. Again, if it was, you wouldn't ever use soap. So why do we use soap when we bathe or wash clothes or dishes? It's because water could wash away the polar things. It could wash away the ionic compounds, but not the oily stuff. And so detergents, soap, they're known as surfactants, which is just a larger class. And what they have going for them is this property called amphipathic. Now, amphipath- amphipathicity refers to, again, you can see that prefix amphi means both. Normally, we would say if something likes water, it is hydrophilic, water loving. If something hates water, like oils, it's hydrophobic or water fearing. But amphipathic means it likes both. And so here's the general structure of a surfactant or detergent. So here's sodium stearate. There's this long carbon carbon end, and this end is hydrophobic. But then there's what's called a polar head group. So it is hydrophilic and it can form hydrogen bonds with water. It can form ion dipole interactions with water. The important thing is if you mix detergents with greasy, soapy water, again, these two don't interact, but the hydrophobic tail that is nonpolar can form London dispersion forces with the oily stuff, where the polar head group, it can interact well with the water. And so eventually it forms what are called micelles. You don't have to know that term, but you have the head groups interacting favorably with water and the hydrophobic tails interacting with the greasy, oily, nonpolar stuff, and it forms a colloid in solution. Um, Again, this type of amphipathicity, it's a fun word, is how we enable polar and non-polar things to mix. Here's a fun fact. Again, Lysol. We've been using a lot of this lately, benzalkonium chloride. So it too is a surfactant. It has a polar group and a non-polar group. And the way it works is if we were to look at the membrane, the cell membrane of most things, it has a lipid bilayer that keeps all of its good stuff that's keeping it alive inside internally, just like our cell membranes. But Lysol, it gets in there. This is showing a long carbon chain of 8 to 18 carbons that would just extend this way, but it's able to get in there and disrupt it, and it's kind of like, yeah, stabbing it so that all the internal stuff leak out and then it dies. Density. We've talked about this one in a previous chapter. We could talk about density of solids, liquids, and gases, but most notably, we know whatever has the lower density liquid is going to be on top, and more dense liquids will be on the bottom. Now, one thing we didn't talk about before, but we can now, is if you want to make one of these super cool density columns over with all your extra free time, one thing you have to look for is polarity. So if you were to take this cup and shake it up, you would end up with a two-column density, or a two-layer density column, which wouldn't be super impressive instead of the 10 that so are here. Notice on top there's lamp oil. Whenever you hear oil, you should be thinking non-polar. But then there's rubbing alcohol. Now, all alcohols have a polar oxygen group. So non-polar, polar. So they don't mix because likes don't dissolve likes. These two are immiscible. But then here's vegetable oil. So it's a more dense oil than lamp oil. But if you were to mix these two oils together, they would stay together. They wouldn't separate out. And so what we have is non-polar, polar, non-polar, and then here's water, it's polar. And then here's soap, which again is a surfactant. Then we have milk, which is a suspension that has both polar and non-polar things. But more importantly, at the top, you have to alternate carefully polar, non-polar, polar, non-polar, so they don't mix. The things at the bottom are technically polar, 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 but these ones are so viscous that they don't move around fast enough to really mix together. Now, the other unique thing I want you to know about density is that typically as you go from gas to liquid to solid, density goes up. But water is kind of weird. Now, the fact that ice floats probably is not striking to you, like, well, duh. I mean, yeah, I got my Sonic cup right here, and the ice always is at the top. Actually, side note, Sonic always puts way too much ice in their cups. So that ice actually goes from top to bottom. I usually tell them to go easy on the ice. But here you can see it's floating. Now, that's kind of weird because benzene and all other things, as you freeze them, they get more dense and they sink. So it's unusual, but it's also a really, really important good thing. Because if you would imagine what would happen to our lakes and other bodies of water during the winter time, because typically the water freezes, but since it stays on top, it actually insulates the lower levels. And so water stays liquid underneath because it's protected from convection where different temperatures would then move throughout. And so if if water, solid water, ice was more dense, it would sink to the bottom, and then the next top layer would freeze, and that would sink, and the next top layer would freeze until our bodies of water would pretty much freeze all throughout. And that would be a problem because not a whole lot of things like surviving when they're fully encased solid. And so it's a nice thing that ice floats, even though it's pretty unusual. Here's the graphical representation of that. So here's the normal thing. Most things, as the temperature drops, the density goes up, up, up. It's getting more and more and more dense. And for water, it tops out at 4 degrees Celsius. That's where it has a density of exactly 1 gram per milliliter. And then after this is where it's weird. So if you go less than 4 degrees, this is where it starts to drop, which means as density drops, the volumes get bigger. So this is the part where you know that if you accidentally put a soda can inside the freezer for too long and it eventually goes boom, it's because the volume was going up, building up pressure, and then boom. And that is it for today. So on Thursday, I'll post notes and we'll start on solids and then we'll go from there.